The household struggle. As February settled over the land, the medieval household became a fortress of survival. While storms raged outside and wolves prowled at the edges of villages, most of daily life was fought within four walls. A family and its endurance was measured not only in food and fire but in the countless small tasks that filled each day. The art of stretching meals. Cooking in winter was an act of ingenuity. With larders shrinking and granaries nearly bare, every scrap counted. Housewives became magicians of the pot. Bones from salted meat were boiled again and again until no flavor remained, producing thin broths barely more than hot water. Vegetable peels were simmered, then strained, to create stews that at least filled bellies, if not hearts. Children learned not to waste a crumb. Spilled flour was carefully swept into jars, crumbs brushed into bowls, and hardened bread softened in broth. A crust was never thrown away. It was treasure. Salt was precious, for without it, food spoiled quickly. Families guarded their stores jealously, sometimes keeping it locked away. To season food was a luxury. More often, salt was simply used to preserve what little meat remained. Tending the animals. The barn was as important as the hearth. Animals were lifelines: cows for milk, chickens for eggs, goats for both. Yet feeding them was as great a challenge as feeding the family. Haystacks dwindled fast. Cattle grew thinner, ribs showing under matted fur. Chickens stopped laying, conserving their own energy. Some animals perished, their carcasses quickly butchered and salted to salvage what little nourishment they could give. Yet every death was a blow. Not only food lost, but also labor and livelihood gone. Farmers rose before dawn, trudging into barns with frozen buckets, breaking ice on water troughs with heavy blows. Children scattered straw, their breath steaming in the dim light. The warmth of animals crowded together was one of the few comforting sights of winter. Creatures, like people, enduring as best they could. The work of hands. When fields lay buried under snow, hands found other work. Winter was the season of mending. Clothes, worn thin from use, were patched again and again. Mothers sat by dim firelight, needles flashing, repairing tunics, cloaks, and stockings. Wool unraveled from old garments was respun and reknitted. Leather shoes were stitched and restitched until they barely held together. Children, too, had tasks. They twisted straw into ropes, carved small wooden tools, or helped card wool. Winter was a teacher of patience, of stillness, of silent work in the half-dark. Even play took the form of labor. Boys whittled sticks into toys, girls braided scraps of fabric into dolls. Laughter was rare, but it survived, softened by the clack of looms or the rasp of needles. The role of stories. As darkness pressed in, stories became as important as bread. Around the hearth, families told tales of saints and sinners, of dragons and miracles, of kings and fools. These were not idle diversions. They were lifelines for the mind, pulling thoughts away from hunger and cold. Grandparents repeated the same legends they had once heard as children, weaving continuity through the generations. In stories, people found courage. They reminded themselves that hardship was eternal, but so too was survival. Songs joined the stories. Low, slow chants in the evening, lullabies for restless children, hymns muttered against the howl of wind. Music was a shield, invisible yet powerful, binding spirits together against despair. Faith in the shadows. Prayer was constant in winter. Families knelt before small wooden crosses or saints' images, begging for warmth, food, or simple endurance. Every cough, every fever, every lost sheep was brought to God in whispered supplication. The church offered some refuge. Monasteries distributed alms, bread, pottage, or salted fish to the desperate, though supplies were never enough. Priests preached of patience, of winter as a test of the soul. They warned against despair, calling it the devil's whisper. For many, faith was the one fire that never went out. It gave shape to suffering, transforming hunger into sacrifice, cold into discipline, and survival into grace. The children of winter. For children, winter was both cruel and formative. Their games were fewer, their bodies thinner, yet their spirits often shone brightest. They chased each other in the snow, carved patterns with sticks, or played with frozen puddles. Their laughter, though fleeting, brought warmth to weary parents. But children were also fragile. Illness claimed many, and hunger stunted growth. The loss of a child was a wound no story could mend. Yet, each surviving boy and girl carried the lessons of winter into adulthood. Patience, strength, and the knowledge that life was both harsh and sacred. The quiet rituals. Every household had its small rituals. Some families marked each day on the wall with charcoal strokes, crossing them out as survival tokens. Others lit a candle at sunset, no matter how little wax remained, to ward off despair. Mothers whispered charms as they stirred pots. Fathers traced blessings on door frames. These rituals mattered. They gave rhythm to the endless days, small moments of control in a season ruled by forces beyond human grasp. The hidden strength. So, February passed, not in great battles against the cold, but in 1,000 small skirmishes, a patch sown, a loaf divided, a story told. Medieval winter was survived in details, in patience, in the quiet endurance of ordinary families. And yet, even as households clung to survival, darker challenges still waited. For winter was not done, and the road ahead led toward hunger's sharpest edge. Hunger's sharpest edge. By late February and into March, the medieval winter revealed its cruelest truth. It was not merely cold that killed, but hunger. What had begun as careful rationing now became desperate measures. Every family, no matter how wealthy or poor, felt the pinch of scarcity. For the poor, it was starvation. For the rich, it was the sobering realization that even silver and gold could not conjure food from frozen earth. The emptying larder. The household larder, once filled with sacks of grain, wheels of cheese, salted meats, and jars of beans, now stood nearly empty. Where shelves had sagged under the weight of autumn's harvest, they now echoed with hollowness. Grain stores were the first to vanish. Families stretched flour with ground peas or beans, but even those dwindled. Bread, once baked daily, became rare. A loaf now baked only once every few days, sliced into slivers. Cheese and butter, luxuries by midwinter, were gone entirely. Salted meat had been consumed or spoiled. The last pickled vegetables were eaten with ceremony, as though to mark the passing of abundance into want. The turn to famine. Foods. When the larder failed, families turned to famine foods, desperate substitutes that kept hunger at bay but brought little nourishment. Acorns, usually fodder for pigs, were ground into bitter flour. Tree bark was scraped and boiled into thin gruel. Weeds, nettles, and roots dug from frozen ground found their way into pots. Some risked poisonous plants, hoping they had guessed correctly which could be eaten. The taste of winter became one of bitterness. Meals no longer brought pleasure, only survival. Eating was an act of endurance, a way to keep moving one day longer. The desperation of the poor. For peasants with little land or none at all, hunger was swift and merciless. They knocked on doors, begging for scraps, trading what small possessions they had for a handful of barley. Widows pawned family heirlooms. Orphans roamed the edges of villages, scavenging. Charity was offered where possible. Some households shared bowls of pottage with neighbors, churches distributed alms, and monasteries gave out fish or bread. Yet supplies never sufficed. One family's gift to another meant their own hunger deepened. The poor suffered first and hardest. Many did not live to see spring. The toll was measured not only in graves but in the silence of voices once familiar. The hard choices. Even for families with some provisions, hard choices loomed. Parents quietly skipped meals so children could eat. Elders encouraged their families to save food for the young, sometimes refusing food altogether. Sacrifice became routine, but so did arguments. Whispers grew of theft within villages. Missing loaves, stolen wood, hens vanishing in the night. Trust frayed. Some locked their doors against neighbors, fearful that desperation would break bonds of community. In darker cases, families abandoned the weakest, the sick, the elderly, the infirm. Not every family could bear such cruelty, but famine forced choices no one wanted to make. Survival sometimes demanded silence where once there had been compassion. The shadow of crime. With hunger came crime. Thieves braved the gallows for a sack of grain. Bandits preyed upon travelers, though few dared venture in snowbound lands. Forests became dangerous not only for wolves, but for men driven mad with want. Authorities punished harshly. A starving man caught stealing bread might lose a hand or worse. Yet punishment could not quench hunger. Desperation was a force no gallows could deter. The rich are not spared. Even nobles felt the strain. Their larders, once vast, dwindled. Imported spices and wines could not fill bellies. While their halls remained warmer, their tables grew sparser. For the first time, they too faced the truth that nature cared little for rank. Feasts became fewer, smaller. Venison roasts gave way to thin stews. Courses were reduced, and bread was carefully portioned. Nobles still lived better than peasants, but the shadow of hunger reached even into castles. The toll on the body. Hunger changed people. Cheeks hollowed, ribs showed, strength faded. Men, once strong enough to swing axes, now struggled to rise. Children lost their laughter, their limbs thin and fragile. Work slowed, voices grew hoarse, and every step felt heavier. Illness thrived in weakened bodies. A cough that might once have passed now became deadly. Wounds healed slower, fevers burned hotter, and death found easier purchase. The silence of the hungry. Perhaps the worst part of famine was the silence. Where once laughter or chatter had filled cottages, now there was quiet. Conversations faded into murmurs. Energy was too precious to waste on words. Nights were spent in stillness, listening to stomachs growl, praying for morning. And always in the silence, the same questions haunted every mind. How much longer can we endure? How much further until spring? Will we live to see the thaw? The grim heart of winter. Thus, the medieval winter reached its darkest heart. Not only cold, but hunger. Not only hardship, but despair. Yet still, the people endured. For to live through winter was to embrace suffering as a companion. To outlast it was to prove the strength of flesh, of faith, of will. But as famine deepened, another question pressed closer. Even if the body endured, would the spirit? The peak of famine. By March, winter had turned cruel beyond imagining. The cold still clung to the land, but it was hunger that reigned supreme. What little food remained was locked away in guarded chests, and every meal was a question of survival. The famine had reached its peak, and the toll it exacted was visible in every gaunt face, every weary step, every hollow voice. The mark of starvation. Bodies bore famine's signature. Bellies swelled from malnutrition, limbs grew thin as sticks, eyes sank into hollow sockets. Children no longer played. Their laughter was replaced by silence and weak cries. Adults moved slowly, conserving energy, as though each step were a battle. Illness preyed on weakened bodies. Coughs lingered, fevers burned unchecked, and wounds refused to heal. Small infections became killers, claiming those whose strength had already been sapped. Death no longer felt distant. It lingered in every breath, every shiver, every cough that failed to fade. The toll of death graveyards filled quickly. Church bells rang often, each toll a reminder of winter's claim. Some villages lacked enough wood for coffins. Bodies were wrapped in cloth or laid directly in the earth. In bitter weather, graves could not always be dug deep. Frozen ground resisted spade and shovel, forcing shallow burials until thaw. Every loss left a scar. Families grew smaller, cottages fell silent, and the empty chair at the hearth became unbearable. Yet grief itself was muted, softened by exhaustion. Tears came less often, not for lack of sorrow, but for lack of strength. The fear of cannibalism. Whispers traveled in famine's shadow, dark tales of cannibalism. Though rare, such stories haunted imaginations. A stranger's sudden disappearance, a family that seemed oddly well-fed, a stew with no explanation of its meat. These rumors reflected more than truth. They reflected fear. To contemplate such acts was to admit that famine had stripped away humanity itself. Whether true or not, the stories clung to villages like frost, chilling already weakened spirits. The Church and Faith. In the darkest days, the Church became both refuge and reminder. Priests called the famine a test of faith, urging patience, prayer, and repentance. Hunger, they preached, was part of divine trial. Survival was a pathway to grace. Monasteries opened their stores where they could, handing out thin pottage or stale loaves to the desperate. Pilgrims arrived seeking miracles, laying offerings at saints' shrines in hope of divine intervention. Faith gave meaning to suffering, To believe hunger was not random but purposeful gave people strength to endure. Even in despair, prayer whispered in every cottage, a fragile hope clinging to frozen lips. The rituals of hope. In famine, rituals multiplied. Families marked nights by lighting a single candle, no matter how small, as a beacon against despair. Villagers gathered to sing hymns, their voices thin but steady, echoing in frozen chapels. Mothers traced crosses over children's foreheads. Fathers offered whispered blessings over every crumb of bread. Hope became ritualized, structured into actions that could be repeated, believed in, passed down. To eat bread and whisper thanks, to drink broth and murmur a prayer, was to insist life still held meaning. The bonds of community. Though famine strained trust, it also forged bonds. Neighbors shared what little they could, splitting loaves or pooling grain. Villages organized watches against thieves and wolves. Some held communal meals, small though they were, to remind themselves that they endured together. Storytelling circles became common, where elders spoke of worse winters survived, of ancestors who had endured even harsher trials. These stories were not merely entertainment. They were survival manuals for the spirit, teaching patience, reminding listeners that winter always ended. The resilience of the human spirit. And still, through famine, humanity endured. Children sang lullabies in trembling voices. Mothers told bedtime stories though their bellies ached. Fathers worked with failing strength to mend barns and walls. Villagers laughed, sometimes weakly, at small jokes. Even in starvation, there was stubbornness, a refusal to surrender completely to despair. This resilience was the greatest weapon against winter. For though bodies weakened, spirits, fragile yet unbroken, kept people moving forward, one day at a time. The glimpse of change. By late March, subtle changes appeared. Days lengthened. Snow softened. Icicles dripped into puddles. Though famine still gripped the land, though hunger still clawed at every belly, the faintest signs of spring whispered that the end might be near. But for many, the promise of spring came too late. They had endured the storm, the frost, the famine, and yet their strength was spent. Winter's grip remained unrelenting, and only the strongest, the luckiest, or the most blessed would live to see the thaw. The peak of famine. By March, winter had turned cruel beyond imagining. The cold still clung to the land, but it was hunger that reigned supreme. What little food remained was locked away in guarded chests, and every meal was a question of survival. The famine had reached its peak, and the toll it exacted was visible in every gaunt face, every weary step, every hollow voice. The mark of starvation. Bodies bore famine's signature. Bellies swelled from malnutrition, limbs grew thin as sticks, eyes sank into hollow sockets. Children no longer played. Their laughter was replaced by silence and weak cries. Adults moved slowly, conserving energy, as though each step were a battle. Illness preyed on weakened bodies. Coughs lingered, fevers burned unchecked, and wounds refused to heal. Small infections became killers, claiming those whose strength had already been sapped. Death no longer felt distant. It lingered in every breath, every shiver, every cough that failed to fade. The toll of death graveyards filled quickly. Church bells rang often, each toll a reminder of winter's claim. Some villages lacked enough wood for coffins. Bodies were wrapped in cloth or laid directly in the earth. In bitter weather, graves could not always be dug deep. Frozen ground resisted spade and shovel, forcing shallow burials until thaw. Every loss left a scar. Families grew smaller, cottages fell silent, and the empty chair at the hearth became unbearable. Yet grief itself was muted, softened by exhaustion. Tears came less often, not for lack of sorrow, but for lack of strength. Traveled in famine's shadow, dark tales of cannibalism. Though rare, such stories haunted imaginations. A stranger's sudden disappearance, a family that seemed oddly well-fed, a stew with no explanation of its meat. These rumors reflected more than truth. They reflected fear. To contemplate such acts was to admit that famine had stripped away humanity itself. Whether true or not, the stories clung to villages like frost, chilling already weakened spirits. The Church and Faith. In the darkest days, the Church became both refuge and reminder. Priests called the famine a test of faith, urging patience, prayer, and repentance. Hunger, they preached, was part of divine trial. Survival was a pathway to grace. Monasteries opened their stores where they could, handing out thin pottage or stale loaves to the desperate. Pilgrims arrived seeking miracles, laying offerings at saints' shrines in hope of divine intervention. Faith gave meaning to suffering. To believe hunger was not random but purposeful gave people strength to endure. Even in despair, prayer whispered in every cottage, a fragile hope clinging to frozen lips. The rituals of hope. In famine, rituals multiplied. Families marked nights by lighting a single candle, no matter how small, as a beacon against despair. Villagers gathered to sing hymns, their voices thin but steady, echoing in frozen chapels. Mothers traced crosses over children's foreheads. Fathers offered whispered blessings over every crumb of bread. Hope became ritualized, structured into actions that could be repeated, believed in, passed down. To eat bread and whisper thanks, to drink broth and murmur a prayer, was to insist life still held meaning. The bonds of community. Though famine strained trust, it also forged bonds. Neighbors shared what little they could, splitting loaves or pooling grain. Villages organized watches against thieves and wolves. Some held communal meals, small though they were, to remind themselves that they endured together. Storytelling circles became common, where elders spoke of worse winters survived, of ancestors who had endured even harsher trials. These stories were not merely entertainment. They were survival manuals for the spirit, teaching patience, reminding listeners that winter always ended. The resilience of the human spirit. And still, through famine, humanity endured. Children sang lullabies in trembling voices. Mothers told bedtime stories though their bellies ached. Fathers worked with failing strength to mend barns and walls. Villagers laughed, sometimes weakly, at small jokes. Even in starvation, there was stubbornness, a refusal to surrender completely to despair. This resilience was the greatest weapon against winter. For though bodies weakened, spirits, fragile yet unbroken, kept people moving forward, one day at a time. The glimpse of change. By late March, subtle changes appeared. Days lengthened. Snow softened. Icicles dripped into puddles. Though famine still gripped the land, though hunger still clawed at every belly, the faintest signs of spring whispered that the end might be near. But for many, the promise of spring came too late. They had endured the storm, the frost, the famine, and yet their strength was spent. Winter's grip remained unrelenting, and only the strongest, the luckiest, or the most blessed would live to see the thaw. The scars of winter, the promise of spring. By May, the medieval world had transformed. Where snowdrifts once buried fields, green shoots now swayed in the breeze. Birds filled the skies with song, and the first flowers dotted the earth. The nightmare of winter seemed to be fading, replaced by the promise of plenty. Yet survival left its mark. Bodies, villages, and spirits carried scars that no spring could immediately heal. The renewal of fields. Fields once hard as stone now softened beneath the plow. Farmers rose with the sun, driving oxen through the mud, their muscles aching but their spirits lifted. Barley, oats, rye, and wheat were sown, every seed a symbol of faith in the future. Children scattered handfuls with laughter, turning the simple act of planting into a game. The urgency was immense. The harvest was months away, but the work of survival began now. Without strong planting, famine would return with the next winter. For those who had endured hunger, every furrow mattered more than ever. The return of abundance. Slowly, though fields promised plenty, food was still scarce. Spring sowing did not fill bellies immediately. Families lived off what little was foraged: wild greens, herbs, berries, mushrooms. Goat's milk and cow's milk returned, thin at first, then richer as pastures flourished. Chickens began laying again, their eggs cherished as small treasures. Fishing grew bountiful, rivers swollen with life after the thaw. Villagers set nets and traps, rejoicing at the sight of fresh fish. Some preserved their catch with salt or smoke, but most was eaten eagerly, restoring bodies still weak from famine. The first festivals of spring often centered on these new foods. A bowl of milk, a basket of greens, a fresh egg, these became symbols of survival, celebrated with joy far greater than their simple appearance suggested. The weary survivors. Yet the price of winter was clear. Villagers walked with slower steps, their bodies lean, their faces hollow. Children were smaller than they should have been, their growth stunted by months of hunger. Elders looked older, bent beneath the weight of survival. The memories were heavier still. Families counted their losses each time they gathered. The father who had not returned from the woods, the child who had wasted away, the neighbor who had succumbed to fever. Graves dotted the churchyard, fresh earth marking each toll of the bell. Survival was victory, but it was not without sorrow. The healing of spirits. Spring brought not only food, but renewal of spirit. Villages gathered once more for festivals, singing, dancing, and giving thanks. May Day poles rose in fields, garlanded with flowers, around which children danced in circles. Bonfires blazed to drive away the last shadows of winter, sparks flying high into the night. Stories shifted from endurance to celebration. Where winter nights had been filled with tales of hunger and faith, spring nights echoed with laughter, jokes, and songs of courtship. Music returned to cottages and inns, accompanied by pipes, fiddles, and drums. The human spirit, battered but unbroken, blossomed like the fields. The role of faith churches, too, marked spring with solemn gratitude. Rogation days, processions through fields, blessed the crops and asked for divine protection. Priests carried relics and crosses, chanting prayers as villagers followed, their voices rising over meadows. Faith was not only gratitude, it was necessity. For medieval people, the return of spring was proof of God's mercy, a divine promise that suffering was never without end. Yet, priests also reminded their flocks that winter would come again, and preparation was as holy as prayer. The rebuilding of community winter had frayed trust, but spring rebuilt it. Villagers worked together in fields, shared tools, and exchanged labor. Houses damaged by storms were repaired, barns were mended, fences rebuilt. Neighbors who had once eyed each other with suspicion now relied on one another again. Weddings, often delayed by the harsh months, now filled churches with joy. Babies born in spring symbolized renewal, living testaments to survival and continuity. These moments of joy were reminders that life had not only endured, but was ready to begin again. The lingering fear. Still, the scars of famine did not fade quickly. Even as fields turned green, fear lingered. Mothers measured portions carefully, unwilling to waste. Fathers eyed the sky, the abundance of summer, shadowed by memory. By June, the medieval world had transformed into a picture of abundance. The fields that had once been frozen wastelands now stretched in vibrant green, dotted with ripening grain. Cows grazed lazily in lush meadows, and children ran barefoot through the grass, laughing freely. The air was filled with warmth, birdsong, and the promise of harvest. Yet, even in this season of life, winter's memory lingered. The people who had survived knew better than to trust abundance blindly. Summer was not just a season of joy. It was the time to prepare for the hardships that would inevitably return. Fields in full-bloom barley swayed in golden waves. Wheat stretched tall under the sun. Rye and oats filled the air with the sweet smell of growth. Farmers tended fields with careful hands, pulling weeds, watching for pests, and praying for rain when skies turned dry. The work was constant. Summer was no time for rest, for every stalk represented survival in the months to come. Families worked together, men guiding plows for late plantings, women harvesting herbs, children chasing away birds that swooped down to steal grain. The sight of life renewed stirred joy, but also urgency. If crops failed, the memory of winter's hunger would return with merciless speed. Markets alive. Again, summer also meant the return of markets. Villagers loaded carts with goods, honey, cheese, wool, fresh vegetables, and traveled to towns where trade bustled. Stalls overflowed with colors and smells, bright apples, salted fish, spices brought from distant lands. Coins exchanged hands, bargains were struck, gossip filled the air. After the silence of winter, markets felt like festivals of life. Musicians played in corners, jugglers entertained children, and inns brimmed with laughter. For many, this was more than commerce. It was reassurance that life was full again, that winter's emptiness had passed. The richness of diet meals, Once little more than broth and stale bread became feasts again. Fresh fruit appeared: cherries, strawberries, and plums. Herbs flavored stews with scents of thyme, sage, and parsley. Milk turned to cheese. Butter churned smooth and golden. Bread, baked from new grain, filled homes with warmth. Meat, too, was more plentiful. Chickens fattened on summer insects, pigs foraged freely, and hunters returned with deer or boar. Fish from rivers and lakes remained staples, now smoked or salted for storage. For medieval people, eating was no longer about mere survival. It was about pleasure, celebration, and gratitude. Yet, always in the background, lingered the lesson of scarcity. Festivals of summer brought festivals that celebrated life itself. Midsummer's Eve was one of the most vibrant, marked by bonfires that blazed against the sky. Villagers danced in circles, sang songs of love and fertility, and leapt through flames to ward off misfortune. Fields and animals were blessed with holy water or charms, rituals meant to protect against storms, pests, or illness. Couples courted openly. Marriages were arranged, and children played long into the twilight hours. For a moment, the harshness of winter seemed like a distant dream. Laughter and music filled the night, carrying promises of joy. The labor behind abundance. But summer's ease was deceptive. The abundance seen on tables and in markets was built on relentless labor. Farmers rose before dawn and worked until dusk, scythes flashing in fields, sweat-soaking tunics. Women baked, churned, wove, and preserved food tirelessly. Children fetched water, tended animals, and gathered berries or mushrooms. This labor was not optional. It was the foundation of winter's survival. A family that wasted summer's bounty or failed to prepare risked returning to famine. And so, even as people celebrated, they worked with discipline, driven by the memory of hunger. The fear of disaster. Summer, for all its abundance, carried risks. Too much rain could drown crops, too little could wither them. Storms destroyed barns. Fires spread quickly in hot, dry months. Pests, such as locusts, could sweep through and leave devastation behind. Every farmer knew that abundance was fragile. A single bad season could turn joy into despair. And so, while the sun warmed their backs and harvest promised wealth, villagers watched the skies with cautious eyes. Community in plenty. With abundance came generosity. Neighbors shared harvests, lent tools, and hosted feasts. Weddings filled villages with celebration. Children were baptized in churches, and inns bustled with travelers. Community ties, strained by winter scarcity, were reforged in summer's plenty. Yet this generosity was also strategic. Strengthening bonds in times of abundance meant securing allies in times of need. In the medieval world, survival was collective as much as individual. The shadow of winter. Even in midsummer, when fields were full and barns echoed with life, the shadow of winter lay in every mind. Mothers salted fish carefully. Fathers measured grain in granaries. Elders reminded children of the hunger months. Every celebration was balanced with preparation, every feast shadowed by caution. This duality defined medieval survival. Summer was joy, but joy tempered by memory. Abundance was real, but fleeting. And as villagers laughed under warm skies, they knew that beyond the turning of the year, another winter awaited. The balance of seasons. Summer, then, was not an escape from hardship, but a pause. A season that healed bodies, filled stores, and restored spirits. It was the counterweight to winter's cruelty, a reminder that life moved in cycles. In abundance, medieval people found gratitude. In gratitude, they found strength. And in strength, they found the courage to face the wheel of the year once more. Autumn, the gathering of survival. By September, the medieval year reached its most crucial moment. Fields that had been sown with hope in spring now stood tall with ripening grain. Orchards bent under the weight of apples and pears. Vineyards glistened with grapes. Barns echoed with the bleating of fattened animals. It was a season of plenty, but also of urgency. For autumn was not only a time of harvest, it was the moment when the year's survival was decided. What was gathered now would sustain families through the cold, dark months ahead. The great harvest began with the first strokes of the sickle. Men and women cutting swathes of golden grain. Sweat poured as scythes flashed in the fields, leaving neat rows to be bound into sheaves. Children followed, gathering the stalks, while oxen hauled wagons heavy with the fruits of labor. The village worked together in near silence at times, broken only by songs of rhythm to lighten the burden. Harvest was backbreaking, relentless, but also filled with joy. Every cartload of wheat or barley was a promise against famine, every grain a defense against hunger. Once gathered, crops were threshed to separate kernels from stalks, then winnowed in the wind. Granaries filled slowly, and with each sack stored, relief washed through the village. The Feast of the Harvest. When the last sheaf was brought in, villages celebrated with harvest feasts. Tables groaned beneath roasted meats, pies, bread, apples, and ale brewed fresh from grain. Candles glowed, fiddles played, and laughter echoed through halls. For a night, fear of winter was set aside. Families danced, children chased each other through the fields, and neighbors toasted survival. Yet even amid celebration, there was restraint. Everyone knew that the feasting must give way to storing, or winter's hunger would return. Preservation of food. Autumn was not only about harvesting, it was about preparing. Grains were carefully stored in sealed bins, safe from moisture and rats. Root vegetables were buried in pits lined with straw. Apples were dried, pears stored in cool cellars, grapes pressed into wine, salted fish and smoked meats hung from rafters, filling homes with the smell of preservation. Herbs were bundled and hung to dry, ready to flavor winter stews or heal sickness. Cheese wheels aged in cellars, butter was salted, and honey was sealed in jars. Every household became a workshop of survival, every hand busy with the work of securing the future. The culling of animals' autumn also brought hard decisions. Not all animals could be fed through winter. Families culled their herds, slaughtering pigs, sheep, and cattle to preserve the meat. It was a somber but necessary act, ensuring that the strongest animals would live to see spring. The meat was salted, dried, or smoked, while hides were cured for leather, bones boiled for broth, fat rendered for candles. Nothing was wasted. Each part of the animal contributed to survival. The cries of livestock echoed with sorrow, but also with gratitude. For medieval people, animals were both companions and lifelines. the turning of the weather. By late October, winds sharpened, leaves turned gold and crimson, and the first frost returned to fields. Fires burned earlier in cottages, smoke curling into gray skies. Families felt the year turning. Each breath of cold air a reminder that the cycle was repeating. Children gathered the last nuts and berries, women mended thicker clothes, and men checked the roofs of barns and cottages. Winter's shadow stretched closer with each shortening day. Autumn faith and rituals. The church, too, marked the season. Prayers of thanksgiving were offered, blessing the harvest and the hands that gathered it. Saints' days honored the cycles of labor and plenty, reminding all that abundance was divine providence as much as human effort. All Hallows' Eve approached with solemnity, when villagers prayed for the souls of the dead and remembered those who had not survived past winters. Fires lit against the night drove away evil spirits, but also symbolized warmth against the cold to come. The quiet anxiety. Even as barns filled and cellars brimmed, anxiety whispered. Was it enough? Would rats invade the granaries? Would disease spoil the stored meats? Would an early frost ruin what remained in fields? These questions haunted families as they counted sacks of grain and jars of honey. Plenty was fragile, and one mistake, one disaster, could undo months of toil. The memory of hunger sharpened their caution. The final preparations. By November, fields lay bare, stripped of harvest. Villagers turned to final labors, chopping firewood, patching walls, securing roofs, and weaving thicker garments. Travel slowed, markets quieted, the land seemed to pause in anticipation, and in every cottage, families gathered around their stores, grateful yet wary. They had done all they could. Now survival rested on nature, faith, and endurance. The wheel turns again. Autumn was both triumph and warning. It celebrated the abundance of life, yet it reminded all that winter waited. The cycle continued. Growth, harvest, death, rebirth. And medieval people, bound to the seasons, prepared themselves once more for the trial they knew was coming. For in their world, abundance was not permanence. It was a fleeting moment between hardships, a fragile gift that had to be guarded with vigilance. And as leaves fell and nights lengthened, they braced themselves for the cold breath of winter to return. Winter's return. The cycle begins. Again. By December, the bright colors of autumn had faded to gray. Fields lay barren beneath frost, orchards stood skeletal, and the last of the leaves blew across empty roads. The medieval world braced itself once more, for winter had returned. Smoke curled steadily from cottage chimneys. Barns stood heavy with hay and grain, and families gathered closer to their fires. All the labors of spring, summer, and autumn came down to this. Would the stores last? Would the firewood be enough? Would health hold through the cold months? The first snows again. Snow fell thick and heavy, muffling the world in silence. The same white blanket that once seemed magical now brought dread, for it sealed the earth away. Roads vanished beneath drifts, travel slowed, and the world shrank once more to the village. Children rejoiced at first, pelting each other with snow and carving tracks across frozen ponds. Yet for adults, the beauty of snow was shadowed by memory. They remembered the hunger of the last winter, The cold nights, the graves dug into frozen earth. This time, they swore they would endure better. The reliance on stores' granaries were checked daily, cellars inspected, meats salted and smoked carefully rationed. Bread was baked from the flour so painstakingly gathered in autumn, soups thickened with beans and roots. Milk, though less in winter, provided some relief, and eggs were scarce but precious. Food was measured with care. Bonds tested by last year's famine were renewed by necessity. And through it all, the church bells tolled, marking time in the silence of snow. The shadows of fear. No matter how prepared, fear walked the winter roads. The memory of hunger was too fresh. Elders remembered other years, when blizzards lasted weeks or plague swept through villages already weakened by cold. Children listened wide-eyed to these tales, knowing they might one day face the same. Illness struck again, carried on damp air, worsened by crowded rooms. Coughs echoed in cottages, fevers burned, and prayers rose once more. Winter was always a gamble, even for the best prepared. The cycle without end. As January deepened into February and February dragged toward March, the cycle continued. Cold, hunger, faith, and endurance. And yet, beneath the snow, life waited. Seeds slept in the soil. Buds formed silently on branches, and streams whispered beneath their frozen shells. Just as before, the people endured, carrying the knowledge that spring would come. Survival was not certain, but hope was unyielding. For medieval people, this was life itself, the wheel of the year, turning without end. Each winter survived was both triumph and preparation. Each spring rebirth both blessing and warning. Winter had returned, but so too had the courage to face it. The endless wheel of survival. The story of a medieval winter was never just about the cold. It was about the wheel of life itself, turning year after year, binding every soul to the land, the seasons, and the fragile balance between plenty and famine. As one winter ended and another loomed on the horizon, medieval people lived within this rhythm, enduring not only because they must, but because survival itself was their way of being. The eternal return. Each year followed the same path: sowing in spring, growing in summer, gathering in autumn, enduring in winter. The cycle repeated endlessly, carrying with it both the promise of life and the certainty of hardship. Unlike our modern world of abundance, the medieval mind never forgot the fragility of survival. The price of endurance was rarely without sorrow. It was measured not in victories, but in what remained after hardship had passed. Yet endurance carried its own nobility. We have faced the darkness, and still we stand. The bond of community. No man or woman survived alone. Villages endured because they endured together. Neighbors shared food, firewood, and labor. Fields were plowed in common, barns, prayers spoken in unison. Winter reminded all of their survival. In illness, community. The power of the medieval person saw divine meaning in the turning of the seasons, suffering as a trial, abundance as a gift, death as a path. Advent candles, Christmas feasts, Lenten fasts, all bound together the natural and the spiritual. In prayer, the poor found strength. In ritual, the hungry found hope. carved lessons into memory. Never waste, always prepare, trust in both God and neighbor. Children grew into adults who carried these lessons forward, teaching them to their own children as sacred wisdom. Winter was teacher, punisher, and sculptor of character. It created not only survivors but a culture shaped by endurance. The cinematic vision picture, if you will, the full cycle. Spring, with green shoots breaking through thawing soil, the laughter of children golden fields swaying under the sun, marketing with grain, feasts lit by flickering candlelight. Winter, the silent snow falling on cottages where families huddle close, telling stories by the fire. This not a tale of kings or castles, but of the countless villagers whose hands turned soil, whose backs bent under labor, whose prayers rose in the cold night. The universality of struggle. Though centuries have passed, the story of surviving a medieval winter is not alien to us. It is the story of humanity itself, of resilience in the face of hardship, of hope kindled against despair, of life pressing forward no matter how harsh the season. The tools may have changed, the comforts may have multiplied, but the truth remains. We, too, are bound to cycles, of challenge and renewal, of hardship and triumph. The final reflection. What was it truly like to survive a medieval winter? It was bitter, cruel, unrelenting. It was hunger gnawing at the belly, frost biting at the skin, grief pressing on the heart. It was fear, uncertainty, and sorrow. And yet, it was also warmth shared by a single fire. It was bread divided among many hands. The first frost. When winter begins. The medieval world was not made for comfort. It was a world of wooden beams and stone hearths, of drafty cottages and narrow streets. And when winter arrived, it did not slip in quietly. It came like an invading army. The first frost clung to the fields, silvering the last blades of grass, reminding every villager that the season of testing had begun. For the peasants who formed the backbone of medieval society, survival was not guaranteed. Winter was not just cold, it was hunger, sickness, and fear. When the nights grew long, every mouth to feed became a burden, and every scrap of food had to be stretched further than seemed possible. Imagine the scene: a thatched roof cottage, walls patched with wattle and daub, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, a family huddles close to the fire. The children's breath is visible in the air. The warmth barely reaches them. A single candle flickers, fighting against the darkness that presses in through every crack. This was the reality of winter life. Dim light, biting chill, and the ever-present worry of what tomorrow might bring. The land sleeps. Once the frost came, the land itself seemed to fall silent. Fields that had once rippled with barley and rye now lay barren, covered in ice and snow. There would be no more harvest until spring. The animals, those precious few cattle, goats, and sheep, were brought indoors, sharing the family's space, their warmth mingling with the scent of hay and manure. The silence of the land was deceptive. Beneath it lay hunger, waiting. The granaries and larders filled in autumn were the lifeline of winter. Every sack of grain, every smoked ham, every barrel of salted fish. These were not luxuries. They were survival itself. A miscalculation in the harvest, a raid from bandits, or a fire in the storehouse could spell disaster. The human body against the cold. To step outside in winter was to feel the bite of air on skin that had little protection. Wool cloaks and linen tunics were common, but few peasants owned furs. Boots were often patched and thin, barely holding out the snow. Gloves were a rarity. Hands cracked and bled from cold and work alike. Frostbite was not understood by name, but its effects were known. Fingers blackened, toes were lost, and once infection set in, death was never far behind. People learned to work quickly, to shield themselves with layers of whatever cloth they had, and to share warmth by sleeping close together at night. The shadows of fear. Winter carried with it more than physical struggle. It brought fear. Fear of wolves that prowled near villages, their eyes glowing in the dark. Fear of spirits and demons, because in the medieval mind, the long nights were fertile ground for the supernatural. The church bells rang not only to mark the hours, but to keep away evil thought to wander freely in the dark. And always, there was the fear of famine. A poor family, with too many mouths and too little stored food, might watch their larder shrink too quickly. Parents sometimes went without meals so that children could eat. Neighbors might be forced to beg, barter, or steal to survive. A world without comfort. There were no insulated homes, no central heating, no electric lights. Comfort, as we know it, simply did not exist. To live through a medieval winter was to endure. Every moment was an exercise in patience, every day a test of willpower. Yet, for all its cruelty, winter also shaped the resilience of medieval people. They learned to measure time not by clocks, but by the slow dripping of icicles, the lengthening of shadows, and the return of birdsong in spring. Life was fragile, but it was also enduring. The first frost was not just a change in weather, it was a warning. It whispered to every villager, "Prepare yourself. The true test has only begun." And as the frost deepened into snow, the medieval world braced itself for the long, unrelenting months ahead. The struggle for food. Hunger in the dark. Months. Once the first frost had settled and the earth surrendered its last breath of warmth, the medieval family turned their eyes to one thing above all: food. For no matter how strong the walls, how thick the cloaks, or how faithful the prayers, hunger was the enemy that stalked every winter night. The autumn harvest was the deciding factor. If the fields had been kind, the granaries might brim with sacks of rye, barley, and oats. The root cellar might be stacked with turnips, onions, and cabbages, their hearty flesh designed by nature to last through the cold. But rarely was a fortune so generous. More often, the harvest was modest, sometimes meager, and always shadowed by the question: would it last until spring? Meals of necessity. A winter meal in the medieval village was rarely lavish. Bread, dense, dark, and coarse, formed the backbone of sustenance. Made from rye or barley, sometimes mixed with peas or beans, it was heavy, filling, and often the only solid food in a day. Porridge was another staple, simmered in pots over the fire. Grains were boiled until soft, sometimes thinned with water, occasionally enriched with a splash of milk if the cow was still giving. On fortunate days, it might be flavored with scraps of dried fruit or a drizzle of honey. But these were small mercies. Meat was scarce in winter. A salted ham might hang in the rafters, slowly carved away in thin slices. Dried fish, if the family had access to rivers or trade, offered variety. Chickens provided eggs, though often they ceased laying in the darkest months. A goat or cow could be milked, but their yield declined in the cold. Every morsel had to be measured, every portion carefully rationed. Hunger as a companion. For most peasants, hunger was not an occasional visitor. It was a constant companion. Stomachs rarely felt full in winter. Children cried from want, their parents powerless to ease them. A gnawing emptiness became part of life, accepted like the cold air or the early night. The wealthy fared differently, of course. Lords dined on venison, boar, and fowl, their great halls echoing with feasts even in January. But for the majority, the peasant families laboring under their rule, survival was not marked by feasting, but by enduring hunger with patience. The fear of famine beyond. Simple hunger loomed the darker specter of famine. If the previous year's harvest had failed, or if stores were spoiled by damp or vermin, famine could claim entire villages. Bread would be stretched thinner and thinner, mixed with chaff, acorns, or even ground-up bark to make it last. In times of true desperation, famine reduced dignity. People scavenged for anything edible: roots dug from frozen ground, nettles boiled into bitter soups, even the carcasses of animals that had perished from cold. Chroniclers wrote of these times with horror, and yet they came with grim regularity. Communal bonds and desperation food was not always hoarded selfishly. Villagers often leaned on one another in hard winters, sharing what they could. A neighbor might trade a jug of ale for a handful of grain. A family with eggs might barter them for wool. The bonds of survival wove communities together, though strain and envy could just as easily unravel them. There were darker sides, too. Starvation could lead to theft, even violence. A family on the edge of collapse might raid a neighbor's stores under cover of night. In famine years, bread riots erupted in towns, desperate voices demanding food where none was left to give. The fire as a hearth of hope. Meals, however small, were rituals of survival.